Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Jennifer Pai. Great to have you all with us. Apologies for the slight delay. We had some technical issues. They're all solved now. So I would like to welcome you all for this second webinar that is part of a series of 4 that we offer during the UNICEF IEP e-learning course on the foundations of disability inclusive education sector planning. This webinar will be recorded for those who don't get a chance to connect live today. I would also invite the Mongolian participants to join the interpretation channel. Yanja is there to interpret. We do have technical staff from ministries of education from 14 countries from East Asia and Pacific, which includes a variety of island states from the Pacific. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Natasha Graham, who's lead instructor for Module 2. Natasha is an international expert in disability inclusive development, focusing on education of children with disabilities. Having worked for the Global Partnership for Education Secretariat, the World Bank, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on issues related to inclusion of children with disabilities in education, childhood disability screening and service provision, she's now working at UNICEF headquarters, supporting the education section in the area of inclusive education for children with disabilities. She's worked with many governments and international agencies on designing, monitoring, and evaluating inclusive education programs and systems. And she has extensive work experience in East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, focusing on understanding the needs of marginalized children and those excluded from education. Natasha will be presenting today on the Disability Inclusive Education Framework. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Natasha. So the webinar will last for 1 hour. Natasha will be presenting for about 30 minutes, and then we have time to respond to your questions. Feel free to either post them on the webpage of this webinar or down on the chat. We are using Zoom, so if you experience any technical issues throughout the live session, please, as always, do not hesitate to contact Sage through the Plan for Inclusion email. And we'll be, as I said, we'll be collecting questions throughout. So with no further ado, I hand over the mic to Natasha. Natasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I would like to apologize to everybody. It was actually me who was having technical difficulties connecting. So I found another computer and managed to connect, but I'm asking one of my colleagues to share the presentation, please. So welcome. Great, thank you. If you go back 1 slide, please.
Sorry, Natasha, that was, I'm having some issues with my with my clicker, but I'll go back to that.
So this will be the presentation on the framework for disability inclusive education. And this is actually the first time we're doing the webinar. In the last 2 courses, this was one of the animated presentations, and you will also be able to find it after the webinar. You'll actually have 2 versions. You'll have the webinar version, which is going to have a lot more information, or a bit more information. And then you'll also have the regular animated presentation version, which you'll be able to find on the platform. Next, please. So this is part of Module 2, and in Module 2, you will have 3 animated presentations. If you could go back, please, Sage. So this is part one, the framework for disability inclusive education. The next presentation, part two, which is disability inclusive education sector analysis, is the second presentation that you will be able to find on the platform. And the third one, we will also have a live webinar as well as a recorded webinar for those who will not be able to make it. That's the introduction to the data needs for disability inclusive education sector analysis. So in module 2, as you can see, we will go one step further from what you've discussed and discovered in module 1. We will go into what it takes to look at the education system through a disability inclusive lens. You'll be able to use the framework and the data during the planning and analysis. Next, please. So in this presentation, I will explain what we mean by systems thinking when we talk about disability inclusive education. We will introduce the framework for disability inclusive education as a tool that can be used both during the analysis and the planning processes. As I mentioned earlier, we decided to make it a live webinar and merge the animated presentation with some of the tips share some of the experiences that we had in applying the framework as that's going to be one of your group exercises. By the end of this presentation, we'll be familiar with the structure of the framework and be able to use the framework when talking about disability inclusive education. Next, please. So some of the guiding questions. So what is the framework for disability inclusive education? What is systems thinking in education? And when is the right time to apply the framework? So these are the three main guiding questions that we will be exploring in this presentation and that you will continue exploring throughout module 2. Next, please. So what is the framework? Let's start by looking at the framework. What is it? When we imagine a framework, we think about a frame. Yes, the framework is a supporting structure around which something can be built. It can be an essential supporting structure of a building, vehicle, or object. And it's also a system of rules, ideas, or beliefs that can be used to plan or decide something. A conceptual framework is a description or depiction of any given system that illustrates the key relationships between the elements of that system. Their purpose is, generally speaking, to facilitate an understanding of a network of ideas in accessible terms. Next, please. Systems definitions. First of all, let's take a look at what a system is composed of. A system is a set of elements that function as a whole to achieve a common purpose. So, for example, let's think about what is the purpose of an education system. And a subsystem is a component of a larger system, when an element is a necessary but not self-sufficient component of a system. So when we look at different parts of the framework, which we will be showing in the next few slides, you will understand how, for example, you work all in different departments. So you're all part of an education system. But in order for education system to function, all departments have to be involved and contribute to the well-functioning of the system. So next, please. So we're going a little bit further into systems definitions in the context of disability inclusive education. We often hear the term inclusive education or disability inclusive education, and that we need to restructure or reform the entire education system to make it disability inclusive. So what is the systems thinking in the context of disability inclusive education? So systems thinking is a holistic approach to analysis that focuses on the way that all systems parts interrelate and how systems work over time and within the context of larger systems. So when it comes to the education system and reforming it to make it disability inclusive, we also need to compile all the different parts of the system and see what and how they can be all made disability inclusive. So one important takeaway here is we don't need to create a parallel or a different system or inclusive education system. We simply need to look at the existing system and look at what parts of the system currently function, how they function, and whether they're disability inclusive. Next, please. So systems thinking in education. And now let's see how systems thinking works in the education system. So what is one important component of an education system? It's the school. Schools are necessary for education systems to function properly. And what are some of the elements of an education system? If we have a school, then we need to have students. Students need to be taught by teachers, and teachers then need to be supported by school administration. We also require curriculum that is adapted to various needs, and all of these components and elements, the school buildings, students, teachers, curriculum, administration, everything needs to be financed. And if you look at all of these elements, they're all necessary, but alone they're not self-sufficient components of a larger system, an education system. Next, please. Systems thinking in education. So systems thinking is actually a management discipline that first observes discrete functions and interactions between components. In education, that would be the interaction amongst teachers, learners, administrators, and learning goals. Sometimes this system is multiple systems of multiple functions. Next, please. So let's take a look at SRAE in the education system. And let us keep in mind that even if we make sure that education system is disability inclusive, we need to remember that the child with a disability is also part of other systems, for example, community, family, and healthcare systems. So let's take a look at SRAE and see how she's part of several different systems. She's part of an education system when it comes to school, but she is also part of a family and a larger community. So community attitudes towards education of children with disabilities can prevent children with disabilities from being part of an education system, even if that system is disability inclusive. So it's really important when we look at a disability inclusive education system, we also need to look at all of the other overlapping systems that a child may be interacting with or in. Next, please. So what is systems thinking? So to sum up, systems thinking is a method to analyze the relationships between the system's parts to understand the potential for better decision making. The system is not just a collection of things. It consists of elements, interconnections, and a purpose. For example, when SRAE first enrolled in school, what needed to happen? If her parents who enrolled her, they also learned about the school accepting children with disabilities through education awareness campaign. Then the school administration enrolled SRAE and she became part of an education system. So you could see how different parts of the system needed to work in order for SRAE to even make it to school. And as we progress through this module, we'll learn about different things that need to be considered when creating a disability inclusive education system. Next, please. So further exploring what it means to provide disability inclusive education. In the next few slides, I will introduce the framework for disability inclusive education. The framework for disability inclusive education is a tool that can be used to begin looking at the entire education system, from early childhood education up to tertiary, through a disability inclusive lens, and examining what needs to be considered in order to include children with disabilities. Specifically, the framework provides an overview of the different parts or aspects of an education system that need to be addressed, including the social context, to enable the inclusion of children with disabilities. While the framework focuses on children with disabilities, it is expected that any improvements identified will benefit participation and learning outcomes of all children, with or without disabilities. When we think of an education system, there are different models of educational placements for children with disabilities, as we discussed in Module 1. But let's now think of what it would take to make the entire education system disability inclusive. What are the things that we need to think about in order to enable every child with and without disability to learn together? What are the drivers behind successful implementation of disability inclusive education? So first of all, let's discuss the importance of community. When we examine, that's where children live. So in order for children to come to school, they need to be supported by the community that they live in. The community are parents and children's families and other community members like neighbors, village or town leaders, as well as other children. This is part of the demand side of the system. When we examine various barriers that the children could be faced with, we need to look at the attitudes of all different types of community members towards how children with disabilities should be educated. We also need to examine various costs associated with education of children with disabilities and explore the benefits. On the other side, when the children enter the system or the school, there are a number of supply side barriers that need to be considered. For example, the teachers, infrastructure, is it accessible or not, and learning materials. These three blocks represent the supply side factors to education of children with disabilities. Next, please. Let's now take it one step further. Once children enter the education system, the school, we need to think of the quality of education that they receive. And in order for children with disabilities to benefit from the quality education, we need to think about the curriculum, student assessment, and provision of learning support. What do we mean we need to think about the curriculum? We need to make sure that the curriculum is accessible to children with disabilities. We also need to make sure that students with disabilities are able to participate in student assessment. And we also need to make sure that children with disabilities receive the type of learning support that they require. All of these things will have to be considered in order to provide quality education for all children. So these three blocks make up the quality part of the framework for disability inclusive education. Next, please. Service delivery plus enabling environment. So did we leave anything out? In the previous two slides, we broke down the service delivery part of the framework. As you could see, there are 9 different blocks: teachers, infrastructure, learning materials, curriculum, student assessment, learning support, attitudes, costs, and benefits. These 9 blocks are important to break down in order to ensure that the system is disability inclusive, or to identify gaps that need to be addressed at the service delivery level. What do we mean by breaking down these blocks? That means that every single block, for example, teachers, we need to understand a teacher is teacher trained in disability inclusive. Are children with disabilities able to participate in regular classrooms and be taught by regular teachers? So all of these 9 blocks are important components of an education system. But what about laws and policies? Are they disability inclusive and support the implementation of disability inclusive education? And what type of data do we need to collect to support implementation? And how is the system supporting the implementation? What type of structures are in place? Are there appropriate support mechanisms at the leadership and management levels? And last but not least, how much financing is being allocated to disability inclusive education? So the bottom 4 blocks are the foundation of an education system, or the enabling environment. These 4 blocks, together with the 9 blocks from the service delivery, make up the entire education system. In order for the system to work, we need to build capacity. We will not go into assessment of system capacity in this course, but here are a couple of examples. For example, if the country introduced disability inclusive teacher training certificate as part of pre-service teacher training, how does that country know whether newly trained teachers are working in inclusive classrooms, believe in inclusive pedagogy, and are supported by school administrators? These aspects are all part of capacity of the system, which needs to be assessed in order to understand and address bottlenecks and barriers to implementation of disability inclusive education. In the next presentation on the platform, you will learn about disability inclusive education sector analysis. So assessment of system capacity is a really important part of analysis, because that's where you really understand that all of your inputs, are you getting the outputs that you want? Are you able to, are all the parts that you are investing, are they all working? And are you having the impact that you envisioned? So the following slide will move towards the application of the framework. So let's apply the framework and examine what needs to happen in the education system in order to make it disability inclusive. So during the school visit or in an interview, I'm sure that you've noticed some of the, you've picked up on some of the blocks of the framework. So we will take Srey as an example here. So in order for a child like Srey to participate in the education system, what needs to be put in place? So let's take a look at access to school. Is Srey able to get to school the same way the other children? For example, some children with low vision are not able to ride bicycles, and often children in rural areas get to and from school using a bicycle. Then a teacher needs to understand Srey's needs. And what about learning materials? We need to think about what specific requirements Srey may have. And take it a step further, the curriculum. Srey does not have an intellectual disability, but her speech impairment makes it difficult for her to participate. Does Srey have special requirements that will make it possible for her to participate in exams? And since she missed going to school in the past, she may need some support to get her on the right track. And when it comes to going to school and participating in activities, she needs to be encouraged and supported by her family and community. That means that other adults and children in the village. And what about the costs? What additional costs does Srey family have as her family, and is her family able to cover them? For example, if Srey wears glasses and requires an annual eye exam, who will cover that cost? And what is the cost of the actual eyeglasses? And next, when Srey grows up, she may want to continue her education and become an example to her siblings and other children with disabilities. She will want to live independently and support herself as an adult. So what needs to be put in place in order for Srey to study in a regular school? How do policies need to be formulated? And what will it take to get these policies implemented? So this is a quick example of using Srey and making sure that the system is disability inclusive. So you don't only pick up on things that are put in place, but you're also able to identify bottlenecks or gaps in the system. Next, please. So this is an example from the annual survey of 150 countries showing progress in implementation of inclusive education. Now that we understand how the framework for disability inclusive education can be applied, let's take a look at where we are in terms of implementing disability inclusive education. This slide shows some of the findings from UNICEF's annual survey, collecting information from more than 150 countries on progress in implementing inclusive education. So what does this data tell you? That many countries have made progress in formulating laws and policies on inclusive education, but there appears to be a big implementation gap with less and less progress in providing disability inclusive materials, infrastructure, attitudes towards educating children with disabilities, and including children with disabilities in IMIS. But there's something positive about it. As you could see, all of the graphs are going up. They're curving up. Next slide, please. So here is the picture of the framework with all the different blocks showing what needs to be considered when designing disability inclusive education system. In your reading packs, you will find a toolkit that goes into detail describing all the different blocks of the system. So the framework can be used when analyzing education system with disability inclusive lens. We will practice using it during the group project. When using the framework and examining every block in it, it's important to consider not just what activity or project or initiative is ongoing, but also look at the scale it is implemented. During the exercise, we will have the opportunity to use the framework and look at your country's education system through a disability inclusive lens. Next, please. And a couple of slides on the toolkit for disability inclusive education. The toolkit is a good tool to provide you with an overview of all the different things that need to be looked at when you're examining each and every block in the framework. It also allows you to see the relationships between different blocks. Each page is structured as what, why, and how, first describing what is meant by each block, or what makes that part of the system disability inclusive, then explaining why it is important or what changes need to be made in order to make that part of the system disability inclusive, and then diving into how to make it happen. Of course, when you're applying that information to the situation in your country, please think also in terms of the scale of each activity and initiative. During the course, we're providing a lot of information and resources, so we're not expecting that you will be able to absorb, for example, the toolkit. And the toolkit, each page provides just a quick overview. But then when you actually want to go deeper into each block in the framework, you can get this information through technical booklets, which are specialized resources for policymakers and education practitioners. Next page, please. So using the toolkit, let's take a look at a couple of one-pagers in the toolkit to see how you can use it. For example, let's take a one-pager on leadership and management, which is a block under enabling environment section of the framework. This one-pager will help you ask the right questions. So for example, when you're doing the group project and looking at block number 12, the toolkit or this one-pager will provide you with the right questions to ask when putting some information in that block. So what type of leadership is necessary in order for education system to be disability inclusive? The support structure has to be put in place at different levels. At the central level, first of all, we would have to make sure that responsibility for education of children with disabilities fall under the Ministry of Education, as this ensures that the principles of access, equal rights, and non-discrimination are better respected. Then we need to examine what happens at the subnational level. The evolution of responsibilities enables services to be better adapted to local needs and allows for greater accountability when local officials are provided with capacity building together with dedicated budgets for inclusive education. And lastly, at the school level, strong commitment and leadership is very important and can be especially helpful in overcoming limited resources. So looking at this information in this one-pager, you will be able to ask the right questions, and you will be able to then apply that and see what the situation is like at your country level. Next, as we go down the page, we can take a look and consider other coordinating mechanisms that are essential to successful implementation. Cross-sectoral coordination, as in collaboration with a number of ministries beyond education sector. That's something that we need to look at when analyzing education system with a disability inclusive lens. Without coordinating action across all relevant ministries, it's not possible to build and support a consistent culture of inclusion. What type of cross-sectoral collaboration exists in your country? So these are the type of questions when you fill out the different blocks in the framework, you will be able to answer and hopefully provide some of the answers as you fill out the blocks. And lastly, let's take a look at partnerships and advocacy. What type of partnerships exist? Take a look at some of the information about different types of partners that are working to support disability inclusive education, and check what is available in your country. Next, please. So let's remind ourselves that the framework for disability inclusive education can be used to structure the analysis and enable a systems approach to disability inclusive education sector planning. As part of your project, you will start compiling information in different blocks of the framework. Of course, during the course, you will not be able to complete this fully. And as usually, the framework is filled out during the analysis process. And analysis, education sector analysis, as many of you probably have been involved in parts of it, it may take several months. So this is the first or the beginning step in doing it. And then usually you go through a consultation process where you invite different stakeholders to then look at the information that you've managed to compile into the framework. So can we please pull up the scoring and the group project, please?
Sorry, Tori, do you have that perchance?
Yes, I do. So let's switch off to sharing my screen.
So we will now take a quick look at the group project that you will be working on.
All right, just give me one moment and here we go. And of course that opened up every other Word document on my computer. Here. Share screen. All right, can you see it?
Thank you, Tori. Yes, perfect. Yes.
All right.
If you scroll down a little bit in the description here, great. Okay. So as you're going to approach this group project, there are two things that you'll be doing. You'll list any activities, projects, initiatives, interventions, studies, and any other relevant work supporting the implementation of disability inclusive education by the domain of the framework. So you're going to be using the blocks and just listing all the information that you have. And then you provide the score for each domain, applying an analytical lens when assessing your activities. So, for example, please consider the following questions. For example, you have teacher training, and the teacher training's been going on disability inclusive education, whether it's a certificate or a diploma for the past 5 years. So you'll ask questions. When was this activity implemented? Was it implemented at scale? Do you have enough teachers who are then able to be deployed to provide disability inclusive education? Was it an effective activity or project? And was it implemented at scale? So, and then you will be able to provide scores ranging from 0 to 4. So if there's no activity that or initiative that corresponds to a block in the framework, you will obviously give it a score of 0. But then if it's initiating, for example, it's just the beginning, or you're thinking about doing it, it's a planning phase, maybe some pilots have taken place, or a small scale activity, that would be a score of 1. Developing, so going down further down the scoring matrix. So if it's ongoing work or pre-implementation, as in you've planned it, but you haven't implemented yet. And so that would be a score of 2. Then establishing, if something that is ongoing and it's in the process of being scaled up. So it may be something that you've implemented and piloted, then you scaled up to a couple of provinces, but it hasn't been implemented at scale yet. So that would be number 3. And then championing, that's something that's fully operational, full country coverage, and activity fully scaled up. So if you could scroll down, please. So here are the 13 blocks of the framework. One of the things that you'll be able to submit your work, and then we'll be able to provide you some feedback. So I thought I'd give you a couple of tips. As you compile all the information, don't worry about the score at first. Just list everything first, and then try to put the date. For example, if something's been going on for 6 months, 3 years, or 5 years, and then try to, for yourself, if you just list all the activity, then put the date from about each activity, if you have time frame that's available to you, and then you maybe write a couple of sentences about each activity. So, for example, a successful teacher training, been fully assessed, and so before you even think about scoring has to happen very last. And then when you are able to then score every single block of the framework, you'll be able to see, for example, how many, if most of your implementation is at a 2 or 3 level, or 1 and 2, then you'll be able to identify some gaps, which is also a very important component of this group project. And some of the countries in the previous courses, then they were able to take this group project and take it to the next level after the course by holding consultation workshops, where you go, for example, into a teacher training department, and then you discuss with them what you listed as far as activities or projects or initiatives, and then the score that you gave it. And then you do the same. Usually it's the team that's going to be involved in data analysis, if you are going to be doing data analysis in your country. And then you will confirm the score and all the activities. And at that point, you will have your entire system mapped out, and you'll be able to see which projects are going well, or what's in the pipeline, and where the gaps are. So you'll be able to then design the interventions or the projects to fill those gaps. So this is a really useful activity and exercise, and we are hoping that you'll be able to use it in your work as well after the course. I think that's all I have. I think this is a good time to take some questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Natasha.
And I'm sorry if I've left anything out. It was it's the middle of the night for Jennifer and me, so I've tried to gather all my thoughts and put everything on paper and give everything that I can, but I'm sure I've left things out, so please.
So feel free to come up with some questions, and from what I can see, we already have a few comments and questions that we will be sharing with you. So we have one question from Solea asking specifically about education management information systems, as you were addressing that, Natasha. So the question is whether EMIS is being used widely in all countries. It's not directly related to the framework. I don't know whether you want to respond or whether you want to refer to Daniel.
A lot of countries are using EMIS, and we'll actually have a live webinar. Tori, would you like to remind us when that is? Of course.
The next webinar is next week on 2 seconds. Make sure I get this right. It is next week on March 23rd at 10 o'clock UTC time. This will be for most of the participants. It'll be Tuesday in the afternoon or evening.
But this will be on EMIS and disability inclusive EMIS. But from what I know, and my colleague Dan Mond, who will be doing the webinar, he's done this work a few years ago, looking at I think 40-something countries' EMIS systems, and to see whether they include children with disabilities. And I think only half included children with disabilities. About 20 countries, very, very few questions, and comprehensive, it's 1 or 2 countries. But good news, in the past 5 years, this is changing. And many countries are redesigning their IMIS. Some are doing complete redesign, including children with disabilities, and not just children with disabilities. Staffing needs, everything that's happening with children with disabilities in the education system. And I believe it's also in our reading pack, is how to make IMIS systems disability inclusive.
Okay, great. We do have a question, a comment from Rin from Cambodia, referring in particular to slide 15 and 16, saying that it reflects clearly that the supply and demand doesn't really match. So in the area of making nice policies, data seem to be more advanced, while resources and materials available to those with disabilities seem to be lesser. So in this sense, and in a practical way, what could we do to bridge the gap between these with quality, and what would be your recommendation or any field lesson testimonies that you can share? So it's basically the gap between data and resources and materials that he's pinpointing at.
Very good question. And many countries are in different phases of implementation of disability inclusive education. And the way I see it is, most recently I worked in Nepal, and we've tried to compile everything that's happening in their system. And then you see, for example, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but if your data are weak, you don't have enough information, or you don't know, but it doesn't mean you need to stop everything and wait until that data is collected. You can do a lot of activities or projects simultaneously. I don't know if I've answered your question, of if I understood your question correctly.
Okay, then we have a question from Hanani from Malaysia. The toolkit can be used as an instrument to assess whether the framework of disability inclusiveness is in place and to extend its implementation. So how can we make the findings more reliable to push the findings as concrete actions, so that concrete actions can be taken?
Well, the framework is a tool, and the toolkit is a tool. But for example, if somebody is working in a curriculum department, they may not know, and they'll know how to make, or what needs to happen in order to make curricular disability inclusive. But then you need to understand how all the different blocks in the framework are interconnected. So that's where we see that the toolkit is useful. For example, if I'm a data person, I may want to educate myself about all the different other parts of the education system through a toolkit. And the way the toolkit is structured, as I mentioned in the presentation, is what, why, and how. So the top one is the what. It just explains what each block, what we mean by each block. And then why is this important? So for example, in teacher training, why do we need to make sure teachers receive disability inclusive teacher training? And then how to do it, that's usually the bottom part of the one pager. But I want to remind everyone that this is a very dense one pager, and for each of the blocks in the framework. I would recommend, if you really want to go deeper into an issue and get into the how to refer to the technical booklets. And that is actually a collection of 500 plus pages. So that's about 100 something pages, between 75 and 125 pages per block. So that's where you get into a lot more meat on the how to, or what can be done to make each block, to implement each block.
Okay, great. So Leah from Malaysia is suggesting that politics can be one of the enabling environments, and she's asking for your opinion on that.
Of course, political will. That's actually in the next presentation. That's an animated presentation on the platform, a disability inclusive education sector analysis. It's directly connected, political will to enabling environment. If you have political will, mountains can be moved. So
And Andan from Vietnam, she's wondering if participation or engagement of persons with disabilities and adolescents can be considered to be embedded under the demand or enabling part.
Yes, very important. And that's something that I just wanted to go through the presentation, but participation of persons with disabilities in all parts of the framework are very important. And often when, for example, I was also involved in disability inclusive education sector analysis in Ghana, and you find out when you bring in persons with disabilities into the discussion, and the ministry may say, well, we have these things in place, and people with disabilities will say, well, yes, they're in place, but they're not working. So it's very important to then hear also at different stages from persons with disabilities, as well as involve disabled person organizations in the process. There are some slides on it in the next presentation that you'll find on the platform. That's on the education sector analysis.
And then Rupkwan from Thailand is asking about the group project and in particular subsection E, wondering whether you can provide one example of an activity, project, initiative for each domain. I don't know whether you want to share the screen again, Tori, so that Natasha can refer back to that activity.
Certainly.
That's subsection E.
Okay. There we go. Can you see my screen now?
You know, as I was preparing for the webinar, I was thinking, in some countries, when they start with an activity with the compiling all the information, you don't even need to at first think in terms of the blocks. You just need sometimes think of all the activities that you have that are supporting disability inclusive education. So sometimes you put it all in sticky notes, you compile, and then you can separate it into the different blocks. Right, so for example, if you look at, you want me to bring you some examples of each activity. Say, for example, teacher training. You have launched inclusive teacher training in 2005, and in 2010 you made it a diploma in inclusive pedagogy, and now you have X number of teachers per year that are graduating, but you don't have a teacher deployment strategy. So these teachers are graduating, but you don't actually know if they're inclusive schools, whether they're going to teach. But you do have some teachers that are being trained in inclusive pedagogy. Then you have infrastructure. You have a law or a policy that every single building, school building, a new building that's built, it has to be accessible, and not just the building, but all of the school facilities. That would be washrooms, that would be the pathways, that would be the playgrounds. But in reality, there are many schools already built that are not accessible. But there's a plan now, for example, from 2021 to 2025 to make 50 schools per year accessible. So that would be something, activity in the pipeline. The next thing would be learning materials. You have looked at all of the learning materials available at the school level, and you've made some learning materials available in Braille format. You haven't looked at any other learning materials for other types of disabilities, but Braille, you have a plan, and you are going to make it available from 2025, but it's now in the pipeline to make it, to order that. Then curriculum, the same thing with the curriculum. You have adapted the curriculum to, for example, for children with mild intellectual disabilities. So that's an activity, but then if you were to score it, there are many other children with disabilities. You have, at the moment, you have adapted it for children with mild intellectual disabilities. Student assessment, an example would be At the moment, children with disabilities, and that's very common, do not participate in student assessment. Exam extra time is given for children with disabilities to participate in the assessment, or children with autism are able to participate in assessment in a quiet room at a separate time. Learning support. You have a learning support program at some primary schools or resource schools available for children with intellectual disabilities. And that could also be engagement from community and if you have a resource center, for example, situation where resource center staff will go to satellite schools and provide learning support to children in the area. Then attitudes. You have an awareness campaign that is implemented at the beginning of every school year, for example, education awareness campaign, and there's a module that's being developed on disability awareness and importance for that education is for all children, not just children without disabilities. This campaign, for example, is implemented in half of the country, and you're scaling it up to the remaining part of the country, or you decided to only target the rural areas. And then costs. You have done some costing analysis. You looked at allocation that you have for inclusive education currently, but then you also looked at some of the costs that need to be looked at. Maybe you haven't done the costing strategy to include children with disabilities in mainstream schools, or maybe you have costing for special schools only. Then benefits, you looked at costs and benefits of inclusive education, and you've done a study on that. That's an example of that. Laws and policies, you've all worked very in module 1 on analysis of laws and policies, so that information would go into block number 10. And then data and evidence, you will look at what type of data you're collecting on children with disabilities at EMIS, household surveys, or maybe you have an out-of-school data collection that included a special study on children with disabilities, etc. Leadership and management, so that's the 12th block, and you have a structure in place that supports disability inclusive education. You have somebody at the central level, specialist, and then you have appointed person at the district and some district level, not all district level. And finance, that would be similar to financing allocated to inclusive education versus the costs. That's block number 8. That would be the cost of, for example, assistive devices, learning materials and supplies. So these are connected, or cost to the family. So that's number 8. And then the 13th finance would be overall financing allocated to inclusive education. So these are some of the examples.
Natasha, Ulzi from Mongolia is, yes. is saying that early identification individual development plans are important. So where would these be included?
Of course, that would be, sorry, just one second. It could either go into a curriculum or student or learning support, a student assessment, or learning materials. It would go somewhere here.
Great. So basically, it's not rigid, right?
Exactly.
So there is obviously
exactly. We have a lot of overlap in categories. So it's not about where it goes. It's about the fact that you have included it and you have thought about the activity as far as whether it's implemented at scale or it's in the pipeline. Some activities have had an impact evaluation done. So you know, for example, that you have an awareness campaign and it's been going on for the past 5 years, and you know that you've done a study afterwards and you know that it's reaching the communities, and as a result of that campaign, then children with disabilities are being enrolled in education. So it's important. It's not about placing it in the right block. It's about really assessing the caliber, the scale of each activity.
And Hanani is asking a very important question. Are these activities, initiatives, those carried out by the MOE or other government agencies only, or also include NGOs?
Well, ideally, you start with what is ministry implemented. But then, of course, there's some activities that are implemented by INGOs or NGOs, and it's important to consider them, because if there's a gap, for example, the ministry has nothing, for example, on school level identification, screening, and assessment, and nothing on provision of assistive devices. But say Save the Children is having an activity in one province and it's very successful. So it's important to know about it, because then if ministry were to design such activity, you wouldn't be starting from scratch. So if activity and it exists in the country, it's important to make sure it's documented. So if you decided to organize this activity, you would know where to go for some expertise.
Great, thanks, Natasha. And then Sabaria from Malaysia is asking, in order to complete this table, do we need to go and visit a school? She's worried because she's saying that they're not allowed to visit a school in Malaysia due to COVID.
Not at all, actually. You don't need to visit a school. You can talk to colleagues. For example, well, it's interesting because each country team, you have representatives from different departments. So amongst yourselves, you would already have some information. And as I mentioned in the presentation, this wouldn't be a final compilation of all the activities. So you do the best you can, talk to your colleagues. It's incredible how much is available online. Even on the ministry website, sometimes you can find information. So you compile the best you can without visiting a school. It's not necessary to visit a school. These are all systems activities, what's happening in the education system.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. And then Rose from the Solomon Islands, can the rubric scoring be used for scaling? I'm not quite sure what she means, referring to teacher and infrastructure. Perhaps she can provide a little bit more background to that question. And then we have a question from Afonso from Timor-Leste. What is your experience to advocate and address the issues of inclusive education reform, as Timor-Leste's Ministry of Education still lacks teacher training and screening for students who have different types of disability?
That's a very good question. You usually start with in many countries that I work, there are always kind of these core activities that are happening. And, you start with teacher training, you have some community awareness, but screening is really important. So if you have two and you don't have the third one, and you could see in the framework how different blocks are interconnected, then you can advocate for the third, because you'll say, well, these two are not going to work. So our investment is not going to be worthwhile if we don't invest in the third one as well. For example, for a long time, we always thought, well, teachers can do everything. Well, the teachers are not going to be able to apply even if they have the training. If the child has never been screened, doesn't have an assistive device, the learning materials are not provided. So it's easy actually to use an activity you already have to advocate for another one. Not easy, but it makes it a little bit more straightforward. And that's why we say that a lot of the blocks in the framework are definitely interconnected.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Lisa May from Myanmar is wondering, they don't really have schools, inclusive schools, apart from a sample school. And so the question is, do they have to revise the MS forms already while there's only one sample school at the moment? What would be the recommendation?
Well, the idea is the more disability inclusive MS is, the easier it is once you have children with disabilities enrolled in regular schools, and you already are able to capture them, and you're better to you're able to understand their needs. It's like a chicken and egg. I mean, there's no right or wrong. You cannot say that you should first make all schools inclusive and then you redesign IMIS. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have disability inclusive IMIS, even if you don't have children with disabilities in the system, in the mainstream education system.
And then the follow-up question is, given that they don't really have inclusive schools, the question is, would it still be okay then refer to special schools or colleagues that work in home services to include it in the table, for example?
Sure, of course. Because anything that, whatever services, activities, initiatives you have supporting children with disabilities, you would put in the framework.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then Soprak from Cambodia, how do we develop the framework of disability inclusive education in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak? How do we readjust our national action plan 2019 to 2023? Good question.
We've just actually completed a disability inclusive education sector analysis in Nepal that was part of the regular education sector analysis. It was very challenging because a lot of the workshops and consultations, it was not possible to do in person. And a lot of it was done remotely, supported by technical working groups and committees. And then the presentation with final recommendations was made to the minister. So it is possible. It hasn't been easy, but you do have technical working groups and you have mechanisms in place. In Cambodia, I know that supporting inclusive education. So using the existing mechanisms and use the framework to structure your thinking, your planning, and your analysis.
So would you suggest that they do a whole revision of their national action plan?
Once you do the group project, then you find that you haven't thought about some things, you haven't considered some things, and maybe you can advocate for a revision based on the fact that maybe you didn't have some information or you didn't think of some things. We found that the framework, and Jennifer can talk about that as well, we've organized a couple of roundtables, and we found many ministries found it to be quite effective in just structuring the thinking and structuring, because everybody is in silo and everybody works on something that they work in. And a lot of times when you rethink, you start thinking about the entire education system, you forget about things. So the framework is a good advocacy tool as well, because you could see, for example, if you have some obvious gaps, and or if you, what I mentioned just earlier, if you have identify the 3 blocks of the framework that work really well together. Say, for example, you need to screen children, you need to provide them with assistive devices, and you need to have teacher training, but then curriculum is not adapted at all. So you can actually add, and you haven't thought about it in your action plan. So it becomes a really good tool to advocate for these obvious gaps that would also strengthen the existing initiatives already.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you very much. I see it's already 10 past the hour. I want to make sure that we don't hold people, because I know it's quite late for some of you. So I would suggest the questions that refer to data, that you keep those in mind for our webinar with Dan, because I believe he's really very well placed to respond to all data related questions that we may not have addressed during this webinar today. So from our end, I would like to thank Natasha for this really interesting webinar, and I would invite people to review the presentation on the website of Module 2, where you can find it. And obviously, we're all available for further questions. If you have questions related to the group work, there were some great questions asked during this session, but please don't hesitate to get back to us, to Tori, on Plan for Inclusion if you need any clarifications, we'll make sure Natasha gets them. So thank you very much for everybody to join today. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, Yanja, and the Mongolian team for joining, and everybody else joining. And I hope we'll see you all for the webinar with Daniel Mont. Thank you, and good night, good day, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.